toss in the coffee to make sure we have enough air for them.
Yes, I think we're ready to start, and thank you all for coming. This is a great turnout. I guess the word got around, I don't know, between Joe's list and Tiffany's list and some flyers, and the fact that Gabe Bradshaw is doing the presentation. If some of you were here a few years ago, she did a presentation on elephants. So she has a foundation called Kerulos.
Yes.
We've been working on how to pronounce it. And I guess you started out with the elephants. As kind of a
They're
rescue.
still there.
Yeah. But I mean, you started your
Yes.
foundation with the elephants. And now she's working on rescuing desert tortoises. So I'm going to just leave it up to her to give you all the details, but I think you'll enjoy this presentation. It's very exciting, and it's very nearby where she's going to have these tortoises off the upper Applegate on Beaver Creek. So stay tuned.
Thank you. We have a couple of our board members here, and I'll introduce them. So it's not just me talking, it's also them. Thank you so much for inviting me. And I'm going to invite myself again because I've written a children's book about elephants. So I'm going to darken your doorstep again. Or I'm going to make Joan do that. Thank you all for coming. I was asking Joan, I said, do you think it's good or that there's good weather or bad because there's good weather? I was sorely tempted to sit outside myself. Well, before I get into describing our new Tortoise and Hare Sanctuary, which is going to be located and is located in the Applegate Valley, I'm going to read a poem to you. And it's a little long, but so settle in. And if you close your eyes, don't fall asleep. Okay. And this is dedicated to a dear friend of mine who's in the audience who will remain anonymous, unless she does something different. Okay. It's called Evolution by Langdon Smith, and he was born in 1858. When you were a tadpole and I was a fish in the Paleozoic time, and side by side on the ebbing tide we sprawled through the ooze and slime, or skittered with many a caudal flip through the depths of the Cambrian fen, my heart was rife with the joy of life, for I loved you even then. Mindless we lived, and mindless we loved, and mindless at last we died. And deep in the rift of the Caradoc drift we slumbered side by side. The world turned on the lathe of time, the hot lands heaved amain, till we caught our breath from the womb of death and crept into life again. We were amphibians, scaled and tailed and drab as a dead man's hand. We coiled at ease neath the dripping trees or trailed through the mud and sand. Croaking and blind with our three-clawed feet, writing a language dumb, with never a spark in the empty dark to hint at a life to come. Yet happy we lived, and happy we loved, and happy we died once more. Our forms were rolled in the clinging mold of a Neocomian shore. The eons came and the eons fled, and the sleep that wrapped us fast was riven away in a newer day, and the night of death was past. Then light and swift through the jungle trees we swung in our airy flights, or breathed in the balms of the fronded palms in the hush of the moonless nights. And oh, what beautiful years were there when our hearts clung each to each, when life was filled and our senses thrilled in the first faint dawn of speech. Thus, life by life and love by love, we passed through the cycles strange, and breath by breath and death by death we followed the chain of change, till there came a time in the law of life when over the nursing sod the shadows broke and the soul awoke in a strange dim dream of God. I was thewed like an auric bull, and tusked like the great cave bear, and you, my sweet, from head to feet, were gowned in your glorious hair. Deep in the gloom of a fireless cave, when the night fell o'er the plain, and the moon hung red over the river bed, we mumbled the bones of the slain. I flaked a flint to a cutting edge, and shaped it with a brutish craft. I broke a shank from the woodland lank, and fitted it head and haft. Then I hid me close to the reedy tarn, where the mammoth came to drink. Through the brawn and bone I drove the stone, and slew him upon the brink. Loud I howled through the moonlit wastes, loud answered our kith and kin. From west to east to the crimson feast, the clan came tramping in. Over joint and gristle and padded hoof, we fought and clawed and tore, and cheek by jowl with many a growl we talked the marvel o'er. I carved that flight on a reindeer bone with rude and hairy hand. I pictured his fall on the cavern wall that men might understand. For we live by blood and the right of might, ere human laws were drawn, and the age of sin did not begin till our brutish tasks were gone. And that was 1,000,000 years ago, in a time that no man knows. Yet here we sit tonight in the mellow light at Delmonico's. Your eyes are as deep as the Devon springs, your hair is dark as jet. Your years are few, your life is new, your soul untried and yet. Our trail is on the Kimmeridge clay and the scarp of the Purrock flags. We have left our bones in the bag-shot stones and deep in the coralline crags. Our love is old, our lives are old, and death shall come amain. Should it come today, what man may say, we shall not live again. God wrought our souls from the Tremadoc beds and furnished them wings to fly. He sowed our spawn in the world's dim dawn, and I know that it shall not die. Though cities have sprung above the graves where the crook-bone man made war, and ox-wain creeks or the buried caves where the mummied mammoths are. Then, as we linger at luncheon here over many a dainty dish, let us drink anew to the time when you were a tortoise and I was a fish. As some of you, if you're familiar with the poem, I was a little naughty. The last line should say tadpole and a fish. But I said tortoise and a fish for obvious reasons. I chose that poem because for a couple of reasons. One, this is the weekend of the Valentine. And also, it really is reminiscent of the tortoises. Not only did they live millions and millions, 200 million years ago, and have been on this earth for that long, but also Langdon's lyrical poem reminds us that love is not only timeless, but extends beyond species bound, beyond the external form. And we all experience that in our everyday lives with the individuals with whom we live. These are some pictures here of some friends and colleagues. This is Jim Myers in India with cows at his sanctuary and his colleague Avina. And so the love that we feel in the way that Langdon spoke, again, is not just timeless, but again beyond this external form where there's deep connection we can actually feel with many different kinds of species. This is Samina. She's a Greek psychologist with her feline in Greece. And then my sister-in-law with my nephew dog, Ty, and whom you'll speak of later, our President Kerulos, President Board Ann Southcombe, with her beloved squirrel. And we'll hear more about squirrels. But I'm not going to let her talk about that because then I won't talk because she loves squirrels. So although we have a deep love and an affinity for mammals that are just like us in so many ways, this great feeling and love extends to our avian kin. Now, I must admit that I have not encountered many people that really express this deep love either in poetry or in other ways to reptiles. And this is an example of a beautiful desert tortoise who's going to be coming to our sanctuary. So that's what I'd like to talk about today. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about who's coming to our new Tortoise and Hare Sanctuary in the Applegate Valley. And we'll do it from the perspective of looking at some scientific understanding, which is somewhat of a complement to the lyrical lines of Langdon Smith, and then talk about what that scientific and intuitive understanding tells us about how we actually create, design a sanctuary and the care for these individuals. That's a very important part of the work that we've done in Kerulos. Anne, Jeff are here, and then others on our staff that you can look on our website. A large part of the work that we've been doing over the years has really been solidifying, informed from science but also from the heart, a philosophy by which we can live and interact with our animal kin in a way that is very positive and is really counter to the kind of destruction that has been going on for so many years. So here's the scientific hat. This is a beautiful tortoise, a Mojave desert tortoise. They come from their native ranges in the southwest, in this area here of the United States and part of Mexico. And this is Gophorus agassizi. They have a domed shell, and they have clawed feet. And if you can see in here, this is the very vulnerable part here, and they bring their arms in like that when they're trying to protect themselves. Now, up until 2 years ago, or actually 2.5 years ago, there was only one species. But knowing scientists, as you probably know, they're always looking for new species. So a second species was identified, and this is based on a DNA or genetic analysis, called the Gophorus moravkai. Now, Moravkai was actually a tortoise biologist, and they named it after him. Now, they look very similar, but the Sonoran is actually south of the Colorado, and the Mojave is north of the Colorado. This natural division. Their shell is similar, but it's a little flatter. It's more pear-shaped. They tend to go into the rocky areas, which is very much like the landscape they come from, and the Mojave likes to burrow in the more valley alluvial areas. Why that makes a difference is because, as we'll see later, is when we're describing about trying to create sanctuary for these individuals who are coming to a place that's not necessarily very much like their native land, we're paying attention to those details. So technically there are two. Now, there is a lot of intermarrying between them, but they are distinct species. All tortoises are vegan. They delight in the native plants and grasses that grow in the desert area. They love wildflowers, and in captive situations, they are devotees of rose petals. There's a lot of discussion about what their dimensions are, but they can, from ground to top of shell, about 7 inches, sometimes 8. And about 15, 16 inches or less. So there's a lot of variation. And of course, some of this data, quote unquote, differs because of captive versus wild populations. On average, although there is variation between the species, every year the female lays 6 to 8 eggs. And between 0 and 3 clutches during the year. Now, of course, that's very much dependent on the climatic conditions, forage, etc. And at 15 years old, they're considered to be mature, which means they are ready to go out and have their own relationships. Now, a lot of the scientific literature says they live to be 60 years old, but as I'll introduce you to this gentleman whom I'll call the Desert Tortoise Poobah. He is, we were recently in touch with him, and he said, I'm taking care of an 89-year-old woman, a 78-year-old man, so they do live up to be 100 years old. So that is quite a long time. Reptiles and tortoises are ectotherms as opposed to endotherm. We're an endotherm, which means that we regulate our temperature in various kinds of ways, largely internally. The ectotherm relies on the environmental sort of manipulation of the environment to maintain a healthy physiological temperature. And that includes digging burrows. In the desert, it can get up to 140 degrees, so they dig burrows and they hide in there until things cool down. And in the wintertime, they brumate, which is a reptile version of hibernation. And so there's a few months during the wintertime when there is rain or when there is cold, when they burrow way down. And it's very interesting because depending on the climate, depending on the landscape, they orient their burrow at a particular angle. So they can go up and down here, right, like a temperature gradient. So if it's really, really hot, they can go way down. If it's medium, it's like this, etc. So they're very bright engineers. Well, very similar, sadly, like so many wildlife species, there's been a dramatic decline in the population. There's high mortality of desert tortoises. In particular, over the last 30 years, there's been a 90% drop. That's huge. When you think of what the range was, if you saw that area, when you're thinking, if that's the extent of the tortoises, 90%, that doesn't leave much left. Again, this is very much like other wildlife, but they're particularly vulnerable because their land is actually being impacted and the desert is very fragile. There have been a couple of military base expansions, a dramatic increase in off-road vehicles, and then as you see here, crossing with roads, there's a lot of mortality associated. Poaching, illegal poaching, they're an endangered species, so people catch them or they find them and they bring them home. There's a large-scale solar project, which again has created a lot of problems. Disease has increased. A large part of this, the disease issue, has to do with the interaction between climatic change and the infiltration of pathogens that come from the various kinds of roads, etc. And then predation. There's been an increase of predation by animals such as ravens, who go after the babies, feral dogs, etc. And again, these are not one thing or the other, but they're very much convoluted factors. So you get a climatic change which is affecting the predators, and the predators then affect the tortoises. So as you can see here, our tortoises have a tough life despite their shells. Now that's kind of standard science in terms of looking at their natural history. It's a real brief overview. There's a lot of detail. They're wonderful, wonderful individuals. And I'd like to take a little time on something that most scientists don't pay attention to, and that is the tortoise mind. We've all heard about, whether we say it derisively to someone we know or whatever, about having a reptile mind. Well, it turns out that we all have reptile minds, and they're all of our mind. So I'll take a quick little dog leg here. This is St. John's Church in Cambridge. 2 years ago this summer, in July 2012, a group of scientists gathered at the Francis Crick Conference. It's a very prestigious conference of geneticists and also neuroscientists. And they took an opportunity at this conference to bring together a pod of people, all neuroscientists of various kinds, to develop this document that has now been called the Cambridge Declaration of Consciousness. Stephen Hawking, who's the physicist, you are probably familiar with him. He was not a signatory, but he was a witness to that. And it was quite startling because they came out, and it was a lengthy document. It's several pages. But this is one kind of summary statement saying that all animals, and they include octopus, they include reptiles, birds, etc., have what we have. This is a direct quote. Humans are not unique in possessing the neurological substrates that generate consciousness. The document goes on further to elaborate in terms of the detail of what that means. But basically what they're saying is very much standard in science. All of science runs on the model of animal models. That is to say, the use of non-human animals in lieu of humans to find out things about human mental issues, physical issues, physiological, etc. So it's a standard practice, but this is the first time that it has really been made explicit and public that everyone's got the same brain, we just use it differently. This is Dr. Eric Jarvis. He's a professor at the School of Medicine at Duke University and Neurosciences. And he's done extensive work in neuroscience of looking at different kinds of species. His most recent work has been having to do with crocodiles, and I managed to extract a very succinct thing from him that is actually understandable. There's a lot of amalgamations in neuroscientists. And he said, the bird brain is a reptile brain, or the reptile brain is a bird brain. And they are both analogous to the mammalian brain, having comparable capacities and functions. So that is to say that the structures in birds, mammals, and in reptiles, and also octopus, because that document talks about that the structures and the functions of the brain are comparable. So all the gears and all the processes are the same across species. We just use them in different ways. That means that this beautiful tortoise here has the same capacity to think, same cognitive capacities, the capacity to have feelings. This is one of our faculty, Elke Richter, and this is one of her beautiful tortoises that she does volunteer work. She's a body-centered therapist, lives in the Bay Area, and does a lot of really beautiful healing work with elephants and all sorts of other animals in captivity that have a lot of psychological and physical issues. Yes, in emotions. So I'm bringing these up here because when you look very carefully at a lot of the photography of reptile faces, you can see the same kinds of expressions. Now, of course, Charles Darwin wrote a whole book on that. He wrote a whole book on looking at the expressions of emotions in faces across species, and notice how similar that they were. That was Charles Darwin. There you go. Relationships. So not a lot, quote unquote, is known about sociality and relationships in tortoises. These are sulcatas at the Ojai Sulcata Center, and they're quite amazing. This is their barn, and everyone's eager to get out.
They were doing something about it.
And dreams. So Horatio and Hamlet. This is a baby desert tortoise. So they have all the aspirations and dreams, maybe different ones, but they have that capacity. Now, that kind of perspective is what we're bringing into our sanctuary, in the sense of understanding them not as lesser beings, but as individuals who may be different from us, say, culturally, because that's really what species differences have really turned into, is more like cultural differences among humans than drastic species differences. So we're taking this whole concept, which is called transspecies psychology, in other words, a psychology, a way of trying to understand other animals emotionally and psychologically from the same lens, but appreciating these differences. We're bringing those concepts into our design and care and sanctuary. So now I'm going to say a little bit about who, what, and why, and this will answer probably your sulcata question. Who, what, and why are the tortoises coming to the Applegate? Well, it started a few months ago in early fall. I got a number of calls, and Anne as well, in terms of these news that was coming out in various media sources that the Desert Tortoise Conservation Center in Las Vegas was going to euthanize hundreds of tortoises that were at their facility. And this is a picture here of what you can see. It's sort of a network of corrals where they have literally hundreds and hundreds of desert tortoises. So we contacted them to find out what was going on and spoke to the director. And we were told that the facility was closing, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife facility was closing because of government cuts. He said that they're not going to be euthanizing them. What they're doing is they're closing down their rescue thing, but they did have a need for certain tortoises that would be euthanized that could not be reintroduced into the wild. And those are the tortoises that I'll be talking more. This is the director. His name is Roy Averill Murray. The Desert Tortoise Conservation Center in Las Vegas is a consortium of several different kinds of agencies. There's the San Diego Zoo, Nevada Wildlife Department, BLM, and a couple of others. And of course, U.S. Fish and Wildlife. One of the primary purposes of the facility is to research desert tortoises, to look at their conservation. And the other component of it is to increase the population. So they have a very active, what they call breeding program to reintroduce tortoises in the wild, as you saw, that were dropping in their population, the precipitous drop. So those were the two initial agendas that facility had, was to look at the research, do conservation, and to have a very vigorous reintroduction program. Now, the tortoises that they were concerned about and asked us about were really turning out to be special needs tortoises. Now, as again I said, is the facility originally had a mandate of doing research and reintroduction. But because of the plethora of tortoises that were abandoned, that were found relinquished, that were former pets, or that were actually rescued, they became sort of a repository, and they would take in rescued tortoises. Now, the majority of the tortoises that were former pets have serious health issues. And those are the ones that were slated to be euthanized because, again, one of the things they do is they made a very strong policy antedating this, not to let any of the tortoises out of the area. It was very strict in terms of keeping them within their native habitat area. But they have all these tortoises that are too much so. Now, it does turn out that they're not closing the facilities. It's a little bit of coconut shifting here. But they are closing their capacity as a rescue center in that way. So they'd asked us if we would take these special needs tortoises, and somehow we said yes. So I'll just show you a picture of a few of them. The majority of them that we know of right now have a missing limb, either a front or a back limb, which could be caused by a couple of different reasons. Sometimes it's a dog or something like that has attacked the tortoise. Another thing that people have done is they tether the tortoise, and then the foot becomes necrotic and it has to be amputated. This tortoise has a dirty face. There's nothing wrong with his face. He's just been eating. This one, though, on the other hand, if you look more closely, he has a beak deformity. And so, again, out of ethical reasons, they don't want to reintroduce him into the wild because they would not do well. There's another thing here where this is common to sulcatas, where you have what they call pyramiding. Now, not only are they ectotherms, but they're exoskeleton animals, where this is the shell is actually their skeleton. So what happens is when they don't get sufficient natural light, I guess the theory is right now that there's multiple factors that account for this pyramiding. In other words, these little, see how it's pyramided on there? That's caused by inappropriate care and inappropriate conditions to live. So that becomes problematic. There's sort of related issues that are associated with it. So we're the only sanctuary. Others came forward after a while, but we're the only one that has agreed to lifetime care. So we have a list here for people to volunteer for the next 50 years. No.
Is that all?
You're first. So these wonderful tortoises, in a few short weeks, are going to be joining our little rabbit sanctuary here. That's why it's the hare. These are domesticated rabbits. And I just want to say a few little things about how our sanctuary started. This is our beautiful Regina rabbit. She literally bounced into our field one day in the spring, and she changed our life forever and was absolutely a wonderful person. She unfortunately lived only a few years, but because of the impact she had, we decided to commit ourselves to being a small rabbit sanctuary, and we have proceeded to do that. This is this is Coco, aka the Puff, and this is his first day out into the new habitat that Anne helped create. And Coco and his brother Raphael were living in the backyard, and they were slated to end up on a meal. This is Raphael here. This is a beautiful Fizz Marie. Fizz Marie came from this wonderful rescue. You might have heard about it. It's north of here, and it's called Red Barn Rescue, Rabbit Rescue. They're absolutely fabulous and wonderful. So we kind of partner with them in terms of they have one function, we have the other. They're marvelous people. And here are, well, they're not so new anymore, but our beautiful Sophia Bess and Rosemary here. Her name is Rosemary because she's probably related to Fizz Marie. So anyways, we have a little lineage here. So those are our rabbits. Oh, and then the rabbits with a flair. Those are the ones, Chris, these are the ones that you tried to say we should lock up the gate. He wanted to close off our deck. Remember the deck?
Yeah.
And I said, no, you can't do that. So our little sanctuary, at the same time, we're very mindful to be respectful of the wildlife there because it's their place first. But we're very proud of this wonderful skunk family. So, as I told you, a lot of this kind of science, but it's not just science, it has to do with the science of the heart, informs how we're designing and approaching our care with these tortoises and the rabbits. And we've kind of distilled that down into 10 principles of sanctuary. 10 is a lot better than 11. And again, this is really based on a lot of the science, and that's really important, is because you know, the science and the intuition and experience are now coming to marry with each other. a lot of times when people are working and living with animals, they know intuitively about their emotions and their thinking. And now that the science, particularly the neuropsychology, is actually reifying that. And why is that important? It's important because it's really bringing together two different streams of approaches. So we're really bringing together a lot of information and knowledge from multiple sources. And a lot of that work comes from the fields of traumatology that have been developed either in neuropsychology and psychology, things like that, for humans and other animals who have suffered psychological and physical trauma. So we have our 10 principles of sanctuary, and I'm just going to give you an example here. We'll look at, say, principle 2, which is providing a safe area for an animal. And this is really important because when you have a rescued animal, all they've known is change. All they've known is some kind of radical shift, because the wild tortoises, the way they're living in captivity is radically different than what is quote-unquote natural for them. So we have to really appreciate that the differential between quote-unquote what is natural and captive conditions, even if they're very good, is a radical shift. And that potential, that difference, that differential right there is a potential in terms of the stress that they can feel psychologically and physically. So creating a safe container as such, which is a concept from psychology, means providing the animal a safe space, a personal space of complete physical, psychological security. So that is really, as we can all appreciate ourselves. And again, you think, well, this is logical. But we're trying to really look at it in a little bit more articulated way to take into consideration the psychology of a reptile. What does a reptile really need? And in the case here, this is part of the rabbitat habitat. And in this case here, so they have a double fencing here. So it's trenched about 1.5 feet with 1/2-inch wire. That's double wire on 1 inch by 2 inch. And that makes sure that they can't dig out and that nothing can dig in, so that they feel like they have safety. We can sleep at night. and also aesthetically is that they have places inside here that they can hide, that they can explore. So in psychological terms, we talk about that internal competence, when you feel like you can be in control of your environment. Now we're using these 10 principles in our Being Sanctuary education course, and that is, we're going to be using that to train volunteers to help care for the tortoises here. And there's another component here which is related to our Being Sanctuary course, and that is that the principles of sanctuary really apply to humans. This is a very important part. It's not so much germane to our talk today, but it's a very important thing when we're in a sanctuary rescue caretaking environment. Because in order to provide stable, sustainable, and healthy environment for another animal or another person, we have to be able to take care of ourselves in the same way. So it's this notion of a kind of a reflexive relationship between caregiving and caretaking in that way. So we have a program here that we're developing called Caring for the Caregiver, which is again based on the principles of sanctuary, which are in fact drawn from the fields of psychology and traumatology. This is an update, Chris. It's been quite a challenge. We have the land. It's 32 acres in the Applegate Valley. We've really, one of the most challenging things is how do we translate a healthy habitat for tortoises here from what we know that they need. And one of the most essential, there's two essential, well actually three essential, well no, there's two. Okay, one is temperature, and the other one is precipitation and humidity. Okay, so they have a capacity to really go, to live in a very variable kind of terrain. But the tortoises that we're bringing here, they are somewhat compromised. They're very robust, most of them, but we've got to be able to work within a window that really preserves and it really supports their natural capacity to be healthy. So we've gone through various things, and Chris has been very helpful with this. The land that we're going to be building the habitat on is very similar when you look at it just objectively in terms of the soil type, etc., to a lot part of the desert. But it's a south-facing slope, We've decided we're going to be using these domes. They're like pods. We're working with a local company, and what that'll do is, this is outdoor habitat for the spring and summer months when they can be outside. So every one of them will be about 2 to 3 per pod, and that conforms to the microtopography, which is very important for us so we're not disruptive to the plants and the animals. And they will have individual burrows, and this will also have a trenched area, etc. We're also kind of pleased because it looks very tortoise-like. So these have been real challenges to be able to meet that. This is not the barn, but we didn't have a picture of it. We have another structure will be called a brumation. We're calling it J'attendrai. I will wait for you. You may know that French song. And that will be their hibernation or brumation barn. So in general, for the spring and summer months, the dry and warm times, they'll be out in this area. They have a burrow they can use to modulate. And then for their hibernation, they will be coming into an inner barn. Now, we're probably going to be creating, because this weather's so crazy, we're going to be creating these geodesic dome pods that'll be an intermediate area in case we get variability. That way, we're manipulating the environment to be able to provide them the most flexibility that supports their internal system and capability. Probably more than you wanted to know. That's it. We have wonderful, wonderful people. The collaboration that we have with the different agencies down in Nevada has been marvelous. And it's really been an intersection of two historically not comfortable alliances. And that has to do with people working in conservation and then people working in animal protection and animal rights. People in animal protection rights tend to be very individual focused and not so much into science. People in conservation have tended to be more focused on species and populations. So really bringing this together has been quite wonderful. People are really making an effort to really do well by the tortoises. Along the way, we've encountered some wonderful people here. This is Don Williams. He is the desert tortoise poobah. The poobah is my moniker, but he really is an amazing person. He has worked with captive and wild tortoises, over 1,000. He's taken care of them, and he's just an amazing, wonderful natural historian that knows so many details. This is his colleague, the Sulcata man. This is Dave Friendly. He's in Ojai. It's called the Ojai Sulcata Project, and that is amazing. They have the Sulcata lady's not here, but the Sulcatas are different. They have a very different kind of a physiology and a very different kind of way of being in the world. But nonetheless, he's a very knowledgeable person. So both these people have been quite tremendous, and they've given us, we run everything by them, and they give us the gold seal of tortoise. We have wonderful local people. Here is our wonderful Anne that I'm going to ask to come up and say a few words. Anne is a licensed wildlife rehabilitation expert. She is more than that. She's for 35 years or more, has worked in places all over the world with all different kinds of species, orangutans, gorillas, bears, squirrels, you name it. Anne has done it. She actually worked at Wildlife Images here. And so Anne is just an amazing person that we're very fortunate to be with. And she's our board president. This is Carla Eyrich, and she is a certified vet technician. You might even know her. She's been around in the area for a long time, lives in Williams, was in California, and she's been a veterinary nurse for many, many, many years and is quite wonderful. So those are that. And then in the back here, you'll see with the camera work is Jeff Borchers, and he is responsible for many things, including me being able to make this PowerPoint. So these are some of the photo credits here that we are, and they also represent the individuals. There's a much longer list, but it's really a multi-agency, multi-individual effort, and we're very fortunate to have that kind of support and collaboration. So thank you very much. Yeah.